Welcome to Live, Love, Play. My name is Ross, and this is For the Love of, a periodic interview blog about everything we geek out about. Joining me today is author and professor of literature, Dr. Jason Tondro. Thank you for joining me today, Jason.
Oh, it's absolutely a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with you. Please tell me a bit about yourself, your background, and your experience up till now.
Yeah, sure. I'm a game designer and English professor. I teach at a state university in Georgia, right near the Georgia-Florida border, called the College of Coastal Georgia. And I earned a PhD in English at the University of California, Riverside, where my work focused on medieval literature, the Renaissance, and superhero comics. I wrote,
Nice.
I wrote a book called Superheroes of the Round Table, Comics Connections to Medieval and Renaissance Literature, which was super fun. It grew out of my dissertation, most fun dissertation ever. And I've written a bunch of role-playing game stuff over the years for some companies who are now out of business because the industry is what it is. But for the last several years, I've written for Vigilance Press and for Fading Goat. I've done some work for Hero Games back in the day, and I wrote for the Middle Earth role-playing line as well many years ago. And I'm a gamer and a comics nerd, and I get to teach comic books every day at school. So I kind of have the best job in the world.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it really is.
So, tell me a bit about, you said you have a doctorate in medieval literature. I get that. But how do you get a doctorate in comics?
Well, so what's interesting is that comics has been an academic field in America for several decades now, and a lot of folks are surprised to learn that, but it's quite true. Starting back in the 70s, for example, with books like Comics as Culture, and scholars like John Lent and Amy Nyberg and people like that, and people have been working in this field for a long time. Especially once the 80s rolled around. And I don't know if you've ever read it. Have you read Art Spiegelman's comic Mouse?
I haven't read it, but I have seen it around and I know of it.
Yeah, well, Mouse won the Pulitzer Prize. And that was a huge step for earning comics validity in the academic hallway. You know, like, it's easy for people to make fun of what you teach, but when what you teach has won the Pulitzer, they kind of have to give you some cred, you know?
I'd say so.
And then you had at the same time period, we got Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, and these are books that had a huge influence on comics. And now, of course, comics are winning all kinds of awards. You know, Congressman John Lewis's autobiography March just won the National Book Award. Neil Gaiman's Sandman won the World Fantasy Award several years back. So you know, these books are increasingly understood to be acceptable. Not just comics. This is a cliche among comic scholars to say that comics aren't for kids anymore, but that's been true. That's been true for many years, and it's increasingly understood to be true, I think, by academics. And then there's the students, and the students love it. I mean, I don't have to convince people to read these books. The students want to read them. The books sell themselves, you know.
I'd say Watchmen definitely is not for kids.
Yeah, exactly. And that book came out in the mid-'80s, you know, and to a lot of people, that's still kind of the definitive superhero comic, even though Alan Moore refuses to even talk about it anymore because he's so sick and tired of people asking him questions.
That's understandable.
Yeah, but comics have a huge influence over our culture right now. I mean, you can't turn on the CW without tripping over a superhero show, you know?
The Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yes, exactly. And the Marvel films and the Netflix shows. And I mean, there's just superheroes everywhere. It's kind of taken over our culture. If somebody had told me 20 years ago that I would get a Doctor Strange movie and it would not suck, I would have laughed in their face.
It's kind of a superhero renaissance of sorts.
Yeah, exactly. It really is. And where I went to school, UC Riverside, they have one of the largest comics collections in the world. It's about a 70,000 issue collection, part of the Eaton Science Fiction and Fantasy collection. And so I got to work with that collection while I was writing my dissertation. And I don't know if I would have been able to do it without access to those books, so books from the golden and silver age that, nowadays, if you want to read a lot of Marvel comics, you can just pull it up on Digital Unlimited. But even 5 or 6 years ago, that wasn't a possibility. And a lot of books aren't digitally available, books from publishers that are no longer in existence. And so a lot of these materials can just be hard to find. But academic collections have the resources that you need, and you can write these materials and put out these academic books. And then the challenge is finding a campus who's ready to go out on a limb and hire you to do that. I mean, it's one thing to say that you're a comic scholar, but then you have to find a faculty who's willing to put their money where their mouth is and hire somebody to do that. And I was very lucky to find a position at College of Coastal Georgia, which embraces my comics work and lets me teach classes on, for example, international comics and graphic novels, where we read books from all around the world, or do a class on the superhero narrative, where we're looking at the superhero across form. So superhero in television, in film, in comics, in prose novels, and even the Broadway musical or the real-life superhero movement.
Very interesting.
It is. It's super fun, and I'm really lucky to get to teach what I get to teach. And there's a much larger body of scholars working on this than you would think. I mean, I call myself, I was given the name Dr. Comics by a friend of mine many years ago, Darren McGaz, a great old friend of mine. But the fact is there are hundreds of people with PhDs in comics.
I'm genuinely surprised by that.
Yeah, me too.
And I'm not one of those stodgy people who think that comics are for kids or anything. I'm genuinely surprised and actually pretty pleased that there are a large body of people who are studying and analyzing this storytelling medium.
Yeah, exactly. The University of Florida has a PhD program in comics and sequential art. So that's actually, I mean, I have a PhD in English and I focused on comics. But if you go to University of Florida and you get your PhD there, you actually have a PhD in comic studies. Similarly, there's a University of Toronto also runs a similar program run by Bart Beatty. And there's plenty of universities in England and elsewhere in Europe. The French have been studying comics at the in academia for decades.
That kind of makes sense. The French have always had more of a appreciation for art forms.
Well, yeah, and comics in Europe are not as married to the superhero as they have been in America for many decades. Now, today that's changing. There's more and more comics coming out, since the 80s and the rise of the independent comics publishers, that where comics aren't all about superheroes anymore. And a lot of my favorite comics are not superhero books. But in Europe, that never really happened. I mean, you had superhero comics in England, for example, and there are occasional superhero comics, but the hard tie between the superhero genre and the comics form didn't really happen in Europe, and so you could have comics about anything. And manga is another wonderful example of this. In Japan, you can write a comic book about anything, and that helped to establish manga as a legitimate literary form.
I've followed manga in the past. There's a few that I've quite a fan of, but in all, it's a fascinating storytelling medium.
Oh yeah, and manga is kind of its own field. Comics is such a huge form that I'm not nearly as knowledgeable on manga as I wish I was, and my students love to read that stuff. So I need to catch up. I need to get up to speed with them.
Well, let's, as fascinating as this discussion is, we're here to talk about Arthur Lives. Why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure, you bet. Well, Arthur Lives is a role-playing game that I first published, the first edition of it, about 8 years ago, in 2009. Arthur Lives was published by Vigilance Press. At the time, that was Chuck Rice's company. Chuck Rice is a longtime game writer for D20 and many other games. He now works at Mayfair, but he created and ran Vigilance Press for many years, and that's where he published Arthur Lives. It used the True 20 system, which was a good game system, a lot of fun. Many of your listeners might know it. It was the original game system for the Blue Rose game. epic fantasy game published by Green Ronin. Well, we're doing a new edition of the game. We're doing because the trouble with that game, the one complaint I ever really got about Arthur Lives was that nobody plays True 20. And the game system itself kind of has gone out of print, and it's hard to really play it anymore. And I went looking for another game system that fit the game better, and I found Fate. But I should probably rewind a little bit and talk about what the game is. Arthur Lives is a game of modern reincarnations from Arthurian legend. So King Arthur and Merlin and Guinevere and Morgana and Lancelot and all those characters have all been reincarnated in the present. And they don't know why, and they don't know how. And finding the answers to those questions is a big plot at the early stages of the game. But there's also a lot of enemies have come back, and a lot of new threats are out there. The story goes that Arthur is going to come back at the time when we need him most. Well, Arthur Lives is based on the idea that that's today. So what is it? What's brought him back? What's the peril? And how did this happen? And so the players can pick famous characters from the myth, or they can invent new ones. A lot of players feel like, well, I'm not really an expert on Arthurian lore. Can I play this game? And the answer is absolutely, you can. For one thing, a lot of characters in the Arthurian background get special treatment in the book. So there's full biographies of the character and tips on how to play them and what's important for them. But then also you can just invent brand new ones. So if you want to say, okay, well, I want to invent, Sir Larry, and he was a knight of the Round Table, then you can do that, and you can invent new characters and just play that new character too.
Very interesting. And so if you choose to create a character from Arthurian legend, is that the only one? Is it exclusive to the player choice, or are there multiple versions?
Right. Good question. So when I originally ran this campaign, and this game goes back about 30 years, I've been playing and designing and working with Arthur Lives and play testing it every time I move, and it's kind of become sort of my I don't know, you can call it my magnum opus or my cross to bear, whichever version of it you want to call it. When I originally designed the game, and in its first incarnation, it actually used GURPS, if you remember the GURPS system. And the characters were the only versions of Arthur and Lancelot and so on, and they had all reincarnated. But as a lot of us understand in today's gaming, players leave the game. Player turnover in your campaign is kind of inevitable. What happens when your player is playing Arthur, and then he has to go, he joins the military and leaves your town, or he gets a new job and can't make Friday nights anymore. And I began to wonder, well, what if you've also got all of these different games? Arthur Lives is designed to be a game that everybody is playing at their own tables. Well, if I want to write an adventure and a character in that adventure is, let's just say, the Green Knight. Well, now I've defined the Green Knight for every table in America. Well, maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe I want to let the individual Gawains that are playing at somebody's individual table have a Green Knight that fits that Gawain, and not have only one possible Green Knight out there. And all of this eventually led, through a number of experiments and permutations, to a setting in which there are multiple versions of each of these characters. And this is actually a theme, so that this actually mirrors the way that we talk about King Arthur. I mean, after all, who is King Arthur really? I mean, which version of him are you going to put in the game? Is it going to be a King Arthur like the old aging King Arthur from that terrible Sean Connery movie, First Knight, where all he does is pray and hope that Lancelot rescues his wife? Or is it going to be the testosterone-fueled Guy Ritchie King Arthur that we're about to see next month, right?
Oh, no.
Yeah. And there's all of these other versions of King Arthur in between. There's the Arthur from Excalibur, or the Arthur from the Once and Future King, or maybe you want to play the young King Arthur who's like a kid that's just barely drawn the sword, or maybe you want to play a master general who's an expert tactician.
Are you familiar with the author Bernard Cornwell?
Yes, I know Cornwell, yeah.
Are you familiar with his version of Arthur?
I haven't read it, no.
It takes place about a century after Rome's withdrawal from England, where the Saxons are invading, and he is a warlord fighting to drive back the Saxon invasion and unite the myriad British kingdoms under a single rule. But he's not a king. He's just a successful and revered warlord.
Yes, this is the historical time period for Arthur. If you go back to the original Latin sources, and we're talking about guys named Nennius, for example, and people like that, that's the very few scraps of history that point to a character named Arthur being a king of some kind in England, position him in that time period, in the 400s, early 500s. And we're talking about half a dozen sentences in books written 1,500 years ago. And we've kind of created the whole myth out of that.
One of the most interesting parts of that story is the fight between paganism and early Christianity.
Yes, exactly. So, this is great stuff. God, okay, so many of your listeners may know of the book Mists of Avalon, Marion Zimmer Bradley's Mists of Avalon. It was one of the most famous Arthurian novels. It was famous because it was feminist. Mists of Avalon is the story of King Arthur told by the women in the legend.
Interesting.
Yeah, it starts off with a chapter from Morgana, and then Morgause, and then Guinevere. And this idea of Christian versus pagan, that Arthur is kind of a character torn in between these competing religious powers. And Morgana is the representative of the old ways of the sort of Celtic druids, and Merlin is a druid. And Guinevere is portrayed as the foremost outspoken representative of Christianity. And Arthur's kind of stuck in between because his sister is pagan, but his wife is Christian. And they both are trying to make him, determine the course of how England is going to go. So this idea of Christian versus pagan is a outstanding theme in Arthur, and you see it a lot. Like, you remember there was a King Arthur film, I think, with Clive Owen about 6 or 8 years ago. I think Keira Knightley plays the picked version of Guinevere. So it's like Keira Knightley painted blue.
Oh, I know the one you were talking about. That took place during the immediate withdrawal of Rome and the initial Saxon invasions.
Yes, exactly. And it's based on an actual historical argument that Arthur was a Sarmatian mercenary in the employ of Rome. And then all of his knights were basically Sarmatians. Sarmatia is a culture from Central Europe, a scale armor wearing, horse riding warrior culture that was employed by Rome in their late period as the legions, as when they were basically mercenary legions, and their symbol was a red dragon, and Geoffrey Ashe, an Arthurian scholar, did a bunch of historical research and came up with this theory that the original Arthur was actually this Sarmatian military commander named Riothamus. And that argument, the Sarmatian hypothesis, is where that Clive Owen version of Arthur came from. Well, anyway, so this is a great example of all of the different versions of Arthur. And so what's happened in Arthur Lives is that the more famous your character is, the more versions of that character there are. And it sort of has a little bit of Highlander, there can be only one element to it, like which version of Arthur or Lancelot or Merlin or Guinevere or Morgana is going to be the one that becomes the definitive version. Like, who's the real Gawain? Will the real Gawain please stand up, And so if you're playing Sir Gawain in your game, you're not the only Gawain. And while that's weird and kind of counterintuitive to a lot of games, and it opens up a lot of flexibility in the campaign. That means that I can create, for example, a version of King Arthur in your campaign, and he can be a bad guy. He can be an Arthur who's decided that he's tired of being betrayed by Guinevere, and so he's going to find all of the Guinevere incarnations and serially murder them.
Yikes.
Yeah, exactly. Which is not what you would expect a King Arthur to be. But then you can kill that King Arthur, and you haven't killed the only King Arthur in the world, right? Like, there's still another Arthur out there, or maybe even a player Arthur to take up that mantle. And now, if you don't want to do that, if you want to make the player characters the only versions, you can absolutely do that. And there's a whole essay in the book about how to muck with the basic concepts behind the premise, and that's one of them. So I've tried to accommodate different ways to run the game. But in the traditional version of the game, yes, there are multiple versions of all of these characters running around. And that was done for player flexibility. As much power to the player character design as possible.
I'm imagining a scenario where the players decide to have an entire party full of Arthurs.
Yes, exactly. I would love to run that game. Now, in my experience, one of the problems has been that a lot of players don't want to play Arthur. He's kind of the least wanted pick. It's because a lot of players don't want to be leader. This happens in every D&D group too. Like, nobody wants to be the boss. And in part, it's out of people's honest good intentions. Like, players know that role-playing is a cooperative exercise. And nobody wants to be the person that tells everybody else what to do. And they think that that's what Arthur has to be. He has to be the guy who tells people what to do. But in the histories, in the stories of Arthur, that's almost never how it works. Arthur is almost always dependent on his knights. And if you're playing a young King Arthur, that's the whole point of the story, is that all of the other knights get together and they show Arthur how to be a good king.
The Arthur from Sword in the Stone was definitely not a take-charge person.
Yeah, exactly. Great example. Or maybe you have one player who's willing to sort of take on Arthur and be that character. Often it comes down to if you get a good idea, a good hook. My favorite one is the King Arthur played by an Elvis impersonator. So he's the once and future king of rock and roll.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that was his Fate high concept. Was, if you know Fate, every character in Fate has a high concept, and his was once and future king of rock and roll. So he's like this 45-year-old kind of aging Elvis impersonator who realizes that he's King Arthur reincarnated. So you get a good hook, and you can just go to town with a good hook. But I would love to run a game where everybody are different versions of Arthur, and they don't fight. Maybe they quarrel over, like, what would you do? Like, don't you know who you are? Like, those would be great role-playing scenes. But they get along and they work together instead of fighting one another. That would be a great game.
So tell me a bit more about the Fate core system.
Yeah, sure. Fate evolved from Fudge. It's a very popular game system. And then about 4 or 5 years back, Evil Hat, who's the publishers of Fate, went in and they revised the game and kind of rewrote it from the ground up. They greatly streamlined it and simplified it, but also made it much more cohesive and powerful. And the result of that was a Kickstarter for a game called Fate Core. It was wildly successful, and now you can get Fate Core. You have Evil Hat does what they call a pay what you want. So if you want to donate $5 to the game, then you can pay $5 for it. Or if you don't want to pay anything, then you don't have to. And it's completely free, and it's open license. So as other authors have added to Fate and expanded it, the game has become very robust. So it's got a lot of add-ons, including, for example, a complete superpower system for a game called Venture City, which has come out. And all those superpowers are also part of the open license. They've got dozens of Fate worlds, different campaigns that use the Fate system. The die rolling mechanic for Fate uses 4 dice that don't have 1 through 6 on them. They're 6-sided dice, but instead of 1 through 6, they're numbered with pluses and minuses. And so what this creates is a bell curve, a pretty pronounced bell curve. So your results can be from anywhere from +4 to -4, but most results are between +2 and -2. And your characters are defined with aspects, which are text, words and phrases that relate to your character, that describe them. And you have maybe 5 or 6 of those, including a trouble, a high concept, various aspects, which are just descriptive things about your character, like thinks with his fists, or wizard with a guitar. And then you have skills, and skills are rated from +4, which is great, to 1, which is average. They go higher than that or lower. And then you have stunts, which are maybe 3 or 4 ways that your character has special advantages that you can rely on all the time that allow you to break the rules in a small way consistently. So maybe you get a bonus when you want to use your occult skill to research in the library, or maybe you can use because you're this is a good example of a sort of classic Arthur Lives thing. Did you ever see that old film Night Riders?
Yes.
So it's got guys who are basically like SCA recreators pretending to be King Arthur and riding their motorcycles around jousting with people. It's like the most craziest movie you've ever seen.
The SCA.
Yeah, exactly. Well, anyway, so maybe you can use your drive skill to joust. You can attack with a lance using your drive skill. That would be a classic stunt in Arthur Lives.
And now it suddenly sounds like Mad Max.
It can kind of get like that a little bit because there are every character in Arthur Lives has what's called a path, which means that's your reincarnation. That's your previous life that you are an incarnation of. There's 10 characters that get called out for special treatment in this book. Some of them famous, like Arthur, Merlin, Guinevere, Gawain. Some of them not so famous, characters like Balin, the knight with two swords, or Pellinor, the knight of the questing beast. But there's also 4 paths which are designed to cover everything else. So there's a knight, a damsel, a king, and a magician path. And if you're playing a knight, chances are you're going to get some vehicle skills. A lot of driving, cars, motorcycles, big trucks, planes, helicopters. There's a lot of fast and furious options in Arthur Lives. It can be a very cinematic game. It's designed to be very cinematic, and there's a lot of high energy, high action options. And so if you want to take your Arthur Lives and kind of go fast and furious with it, you can totally do that.
Fascinating. It sounds very robust and diverse.
Well, it's got a lot of cinematic action, but a lot of supernatural occult conspiracy. And Fate is a good game system for simulating our favorite books and films. It's a very narrative-driven system. And the players have a lot of power to control the setting and control the flow of the story. Every Fate player has these little tokens called Fate points. And you can spend Fate points to make something true in the game, or to create new aspects on the setting or on other characters or even on things. And this bleeds into Arthur Lives too. So for example, Merlin created a lot of magical items and items of enchantment in the myth. He had a banner, like one of those war standards, like a flag, and he would carry it around, and the banner depicted a dragon. Well, Merlin's dragon banner would actually turn into a dragon in battle and breathe fire on Arthur's enemies. Well, you can do that in the game, and Merlin can create his own dragon banner. It costs him nothing, but he can only do it once. Well, once you create that banner, it can be whatever shape you want. And the bigger it is, the more powerful the dragon, you have to be able to carry it around. So, I mean, if you make your iPad your dragon banner, then it's pocketable and very convenient to travel, but the dragon's not very big. But if you turn the Jumbotron into your dragon banner, well, now you get an enormous dragon, but to use it, you have to lure the bad guys into the stadium. So there's a lot of control for the players.
You could say that the dragon on the iPad is connected to the internet, making it an infinitely large dragon.
Well, the trick to all of these echoes, when you bring back a magic item from the Arthurian age, you have to obey certain kind of restrictions. And the trick with the dragon banner is that you can put the dragon on anything that has a picture on it. So it could be an iPad or a painting or whatever, but that object, that physical object, becomes gets the picture of the dragon on it, and then the dragon will come to life and kind of climb out of the picture. And the bigger the picture, the more powerful the dragon. But as I say, this creates logistical problems. And that's just one example. I mean, there's all kinds of these magical echoes in the setting. Everything from Gawain's famous horse to Camelot itself, and the Sword of the Stone, and all kinds of other things.
Very interesting. My mind's racing with ideas and possibilities right now.
Good. I mean, that's the idea. You know, when I've run a lot of Arthur Lives over the years, and a lot of players feel like, well, do I have to be a King Arthur expert to play this game? I'm pretty sure that most of you out there know more about King Arthur than Guy Ritchie, and he's making $1 billion movie out of it, right? Like, have fun. That's the beauty of Arthur, is that we are all kind of empowered to take this legend and this myth and make it our own. And you don't even have to have Arthur in your game. Some of the best Arthur Lives games I've run are games where nobody played Arthur, and Guinevere had to step up and take the lead. Or Merlin is the guy in charge, and it becomes a Hunt for Arthur campaign. Or Sir Gawain, who was Arthur's nephew and was the heir to the throne. I mean, a lot of people don't remember this because Gawain never makes it into the movies. But Arthur had a nephew, and that oldest nephew is Gawain. And Gawain often was given Excalibur by Arthur, and he was Arthur's sort of designated heir. Gawain makes a great leading man for your Arthur Lives campaign if nobody wants to play Arthur. And there's so many ways you can play it, so many options. And you can just have fun with it, you know. You can have a group made completely up of the most famous characters that never got movies made about them, you know, and you make up your own enchanters and your own king that join the round table or whatever. And you invent your own histories for those characters and tell your own stories in the modern day, inspired by these Arthurian legends that nobody but you has ever heard of.
So what inspired you to write the game in the first place?
That's a good question. So, well, I mean, my love for King Arthur goes back to some of my youngest memories, you know, and some of the books that I read. My mother gave me a set of 4 books of mythology when I was a kid, and I basically grew up learning how to read using those books. But when I was an undergraduate, I was probably about 19, 20 years old, and I took my first class of Arthurian literature from a guy named Philip Boardman at the University of Nevada in Reno. That was my undergraduate. And I got to read a bunch of these myths and legends in their original material. And that's when I first came up with the idea of doing a game with Arthurian reincarnations in the present. And at that time, in my gaming group, there were a lot of us. You know, there were like 30 of us that all kind of knew each other. We were all gamers, and we all played different games, but we were all kind of in the same crowd. Well, a few of us got into this new idea of creating enormous games where all 30 of our friends would all be in the game together. And we would run it as throughout the week. We would get like this 5 people together on Monday, and then this other group of 6 on Tuesday, and then this third group on Wednesday. And people would move in and out of each group, and it was all telling one enormous story. It was the kind of thing you can only do when you're an undergraduate living on campus with nothing to do, right?
Well, that sounds pretty complicated.
Yeah, it was. It was really complicated. We ran a few of them. Like a friend of mine, Roger Frederick, ran this amazing game he called Ragnarok, where we were all modern day versions of the Asgardian gods. And then I ran one too. And the Arthur version was one of my attempts to run this game. And I made up a bunch of characters, and all the players made up their characters, and we started to run it. And I got about 3 sessions in, and I realized I had not done anywhere near the level of work required to really do this game right. And I just shut it down immediately. And I realized, holy crap, like I'm going to have to do a ton of work to run this game. And it sort of simmered in the background from that point forward. And I went looking for a game system that was the right system for it. And I played on a lot of different game systems. I tried the Over the Edge game system, which is called Warp now. I don't know if you know it. It's published by Atlas. But it's a very free-form kind of game where you basically describe your character. Modern-day King Arthur, and you give it a dice, like 3 dice. And whatever modern-day King Arthur can do, you can do with 3 dice. You know, it's like very open-ended. I tried to make up my own game system. But I'm not really that kind of guy. I'm not the kind of guy that invents his own system.
Sounds like something that would take a lot of math.
Yeah, I prefer to take a game system and see what I can do with it, and try to find a game that plays that system very well. And then I decided to try to publish it, and I wrote it up using True 20 because True 20 was in many ways a very good fit. True 20 had 3 classes. It has basically a fighting class, a wizard class, and a skill-based class. And in Arthur Lives, that fits very well with knights, enchanters, and damsels. Like the women in Arthur are all the people that solve problems that aren't conflict related, that aren't punching people, right?
Yeah.
And so the system fit. I went looking for a home for it, and Chuck Rice had also published a book called Legends of Excalibur, which was a D20 open license book, also using True 20 for playing Arthurian characters in the age of King Arthur. And I sent my manuscript to Chuck, and I said, will you publish my game? And Chuck, to his eternal credit, said, yeah. and so he gave me kind of my break for Arthur Lives. And at the time, this was, like I say, back in the late 2000s, the open license D20 market was pretty active, but it was hard to publish big books as an open license. You kind of had to sell it on RPG Now for like $5, and anything that was too big, nobody was going to buy. So we broke up the book into 3 separate products: a player's guide with all the character creation stuff and the rules for magic, a narrator's book, which had all the bad guys and secret history of the occult world and all that stuff in it, and then an adventure, an introductory adventure designed to bring everybody together, and that was called The Best Night in the World. And those books are all still available. Vigilance Press still sells them all with True 20. But nobody plays True 20, which is, as I say, a lot of people have read the game over the years, and they all like it. I've gotten just amazing, wonderful, very, very loving, touching letters about Arthur Lives, about how much people like it. And they all say the same thing: I can't wait to convert this to my favorite game system.
My only experience so far with tabletop RPGs is D20. I'm actually in the middle of organizing and running a game right now that runs on D20.
Yes, exactly, and that's what the original Arthur Lives was. True 20 is just D20. It's a simplified version of D20, so it only has 3 classes. It uses like feats for everything. And it doesn't have hit points. The main thing that it does is it gets rid of hit points, and it creates sort of conditions. So when you get hit, instead of rolling damage, you have kind of a flat damage number, and the target makes a saving throw against your damage. And if they fail the saving throw, then they're hurt, basically. And the more you get hurt, the harder your saves are. But it's simplified, but it's absolutely D20, and it was published under the D20 open license back in the 80s, in the 2000s. Green Ronin did a bunch of stuff with D20, including Mutants and Masterminds, for example, which is a D20 system, and the Blue Rose fantasy game. Now Blue Rose has shifted over to the Fantasy Age game system. The system that they use for the Dragon Age RPG and a number of other games, and D20 is. I mean, there's still a lot of people still play D20, and there's a lot of games that use it. It's kind of the lingua franca, the common tongue of role playing. I'm not surprised that the only role playing game you've ever done is D20. I'm actually running right now a D&D game set in Middle Earth using the Adventures in Middle Earth game by Cubicle 7. Do I have that name right?
Very cool.
And that's a D20 game.
Well, my experience is so limited because I've only recently started getting into tabletop RPGs.
I game online too a lot. I've played a lot of MMOs, especially I'm playing Conan Exiles right now. It's super fun. But tabletop gaming is a uniquely social experience.
Yes, it is.
It's different than playing your video games. Even video gaming with your friends in the room. Players have so much more freedom and to tell a story together Role playing is wonderful. I've role played almost my entire life, and I wouldn't be who I am if I couldn't game. I don't know what I would do. And the diversity of role playing games is so great. I mean, there's everything from like old school high math, really sort of crunchy rule systems that you have to memorize a dozen books to play, all the way down to totally freeform games like The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which has like the rules are basically a 3x5 card, you know, and it's so fun, and a lot of alcohol is involved in that game, by the way.
Oh, nice.
And it's just wonderful. So gaming it's just a wonderful community and a wonderful group of people, and it's so diverse. So many amazing people with their own stories to tell and their own skills. All of my best friends I've met in the game store, you know.
Well, I've noticed one of the reasons I've gotten into it recently is because the popularity of tabletop games has really spiked recently, at least from my perspective.
I kind of blame Big Bang Theory.
Really?
Don't get me wrong. I'd love for role playing to take a lot of the credit, and it does, because it is a good thing. It's a good game. A good game is good for your mind, and it's good for your social group, and it's good for your family. Gaming has gotten old enough that gamers are starting to raise little gamer children in their household, you know, and parents and their kids can game. There's a long history of using D&D in libraries, for example, school libraries, and there's a lot of that. But to break through into popular culture, we kind of needed television to do that. There's been an increasing willingness by big name Hollywood actors to kind of come out and be geeky and proud of it.
Like Vin Diesel.
Yeah, Vin Diesel is the kind of archetypal example. That's exactly who I was thinking of. But he's only been the first. There's been a bunch of other actors and actresses now who play D&D like on YouTube with all of their nerd friends, and you're like, oh my God, like I paid $11 to watch that person in a movie last night, and here they are playing D&D. And it's been very validating for all of the nerds in us, you know.
Critical Role is a good example.
Yes, Critical Role is probably the most popular, wonderful breakout example. Did you see Stranger Things?
I have not yet.
You have to watch it quick because the second season's coming out soon, and you don't want to have to catch up. But Stranger Things is basically about a D&D game. I mean, I'm grossly simplifying, but I'm not exaggerating at all when I say that the opening shot of Stranger Things is a D&D game, and the closing shot is a D&D game, and it's basically a bunch of kids trying to get their group back together when one of them doesn't show up for a game. So there's a lot of that in it, and we've begun to recognize it. Now, a show like Big Bang Theory, it can be very problematic. People kind of either love or hate Big Bang Theory. I don't know where you stand on it.
It's okay.
It's okay. But one of the problems with it is that it portrays geeks as all kind of, you know, socially misfits, and we can't carry on a conversation.
It's a situational comedy, so they're going to tend things toward the satirical. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they play a lot of D&D on that show, and they get Will Wheaton on there, and Will Wheaton's another great example of a celebrity who's made a lot of fame for himself playing D&D.
Yeah, and he's got his own RPG show called Titan's Grave.
Yeah, exactly, and that uses the Fantasy Age system from Green Ronin that we were talking about earlier.
Now I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and you know, Wheaton is kind of the king of nerd culture, you know, and
with the worst luck on the planet.
Yeah, we're very lucky that D&D and tabletop role-playing in general has started to become much more accepted. But a lot of the reason for that acceptance has been celebrity endorsements, which I'm not going to complain about, believe me. That's great.
My first introduction to a D&D show wasn't Critical Role. It was a show put on by a Texas production company, Rooster Teeth. Their gaming group, Achievement Hunter, started a campaign, and branching out from that is where I found Critical Role, and now I'm pretty well hooked.
Yeah, I'm overwhelmed by the astonishing number of really great podcasts and YouTube channels devoted to watching people play your favorite game. It's great.
I'm starting one for this channel here soon, the game that I mentioned before.
Outstanding. Like, if you have room, please send me an invite. I would love to play.
Oh, certainly. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about inviting people in to play the bad guys in boss fights.
All right, now be careful with that.
Yeah.
That's a lot of fun, and you'll have a lot of people that want to do that. If I was myself running that campaign and I was not broadcasting it, it was just for my table, I would never do that again. I've done it before. I've had special guests come in just to play the bad guy, or just to finish off a campaign. But
did they get lucky and wipe the party?
Well, what happens is you have to remember, this is the one of the big challenges of running a role-playing game is to avoid adversarial tactics. It's not about the GM versus the players. And when you fall into that trap, the game becomes less fun for everyone. What it's about is the players and the GM telling a story together, and the GM wants the players to succeed. He just wants it to be as hard and challenging as possible while they succeed.
Of course.
The GM's job is to sort of, point out the wrinkles in the plan, and often by somebody exploiting those wrinkles. But if the players all fail and the players all die, it makes a good story, but it's not always very fun. And I've had my share of TPKs, total party kills, in my campaign. But what happens when you bring in a guest star to play the bad guy is the guest star becomes the star of the show. It becomes not about the players fighting the boss. It becomes about the boss. Now, that's not necessarily always bad, but it should be a decision that you make. Do it on purpose because you want the show to be about the guest star. But if you want the show to be about the players, don't bring in a guest star and be the bad guy yourself. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
It's interesting because this reminds me of a conversation I was just reading where Avi Arad, the guy who produces the Marvel movies, was being interviewed, and he was asked about Marvel films. And the criticism was that Marvel's superhero movies, the villains are not as interesting or dynamic as the heroes. And his answer was, you're right, they're not. And I'm good with that. If we're going to be the brand in which the star is on the heroes, and it's really about the heroes, it's not about the bad guys. And he was intentionally contrasting with The Dark Knight and the other Batman movies, I think, where the Joker kind of overwhelmed the movie, I think there's room for both. I'm not trying to say one's better than the other, but I think that as game masters, we should remember that we're making a conscious choice when we do that and figure out who our audience is. My personal tabletop group, I would never bring in a group of, I would never bring in a ringer like that. But if everybody in the group knew that I'm bringing in somebody else to be a special guest star and we're all there to make that special guest star look awesome, I would totally do that. And then we would show that on YouTube and we would get 1 million hits,
Okay. I think I understand what you're saying.
It's all about expectations in the audience. I mean, as soon as you begin playing the game on YouTube or on a podcast, your audience is not the same as playing it at your table at home. And the people you have to please is now different. A game master is a host. He's a party host, and his goal is to make sure everybody at that table has fun. But when you're running a podcast, well, now all of you together are speaking to a much larger audience, and the goals and the objectives are totally different. I'm just theory crafting. You're going to have a lot more experience with this than me. I've done games on podcasts before, but you're going to be learning the hard way by going in there and doing it.
That's the best way to learn. Trial by fire.
Well, it's certainly exciting.
One of. I mean, I definitely appreciate all the advice you're giving me now. I'm listening very intently.
Oh, don't take my. Believe me, I've got no standing when it comes to podcasts. I'm running games for large crowds. I've run games at my own table for 30 years, but you don't need me. You'll do just fine on your own. And I look forward to watching your show I'll be learning from you.
Alrighty, but taking it back to the original subject now. We talked about your inspiration. We talked about fake core. Why the modern day? There's no shortage of source material to have it set in Arthurian legend or even Arthurian history. Why the modern day?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've always I love. There's a lot of reasons for this. First off, some of your audience might know Matt Wagner's comic Mage. This comic Mage first came out in the mid-'80s. A sequel, Mage 2, The Hero Defined, came out in the 90s. Matt Wagner just this month at Emerald City Con announced the final volume, Mage 3, coming out this year. Mage is a comic about a guy whose name is Kevin Matchstick. And Kevin Matchstick finds out in the second to last issue of his comic that he is a reincarnation of King Arthur. And it's a modern day story. He drives around in a car with a girl who turned out to be the Lady of the Lake. And his Excalibur is a baseball bat that glows in the dark. Mage is a wonderful book. And the reason why I bring it up is because when Matt Wagner was making Mage, he wanted to make it realistic and relevant. He wanted to make a King Arthur story that the readers could identify with and recognize as their own lives. It came out a couple of years after Camelot 3000, another very influential and famous tale of King Arthur reincarnated, a DC comic written by Mike Barr and drawn by Brian Boland, the amazingly talented Brian Boland. But that's an Arthur reincarnated story that's set in the 31st century. So it's a science fiction fantasy story with Earth invaded by aliens. I wanted to tell an Arthur story. I set it in the present so that the players would feel like they had a grounding. Like if you don't know anything about King Arthur, you know the present day. You know the world that the game is set in. So it feels less alien to you. Plus, I was already running a fantasy game, and I wanted to do something that allowed me to tap into current events and the headline news. Current events and headline news are a wonderful source of infinite adventure ideas, And I wanted to talk about, our favorite noodle joint around the corner, and I wanted to set it in a city that we recognized. That's all wonderful role-playing material. So that was why I set it in the present. But it also became a very useful contrast to all of those other games you're talking about. There are dozens of King Arthur RPGs, the greatest of which is Greg Stafford's Pendragon, published by Chaosium in many editions over several decades. It's an amazing game, and Stafford's knowledge of the King Arthur lore is, quite frankly, I think second to none. Certainly nobody is better qualified to talk about it as a game than Stafford, who's converted every single Arthurian legend into an adventure for that game system.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing, Pendragon. And a lot of people don't play it because one of the problems with playing in the era of King Arthur is that you're not Arthur. You're making a brand new first level fighter or whatever. And there's all of these other knights in that time period, and they're all more famous and better than you. And for a lot of players, that's a huge turnoff. Like, they don't even want to walk into that setting. They want to be in a setting where they are the stars. There's a whole argument about why those games actually work just fine, but that's not our topic for today. But it's the same reason why people don't want to play in, for example, they don't want to play a Game of Thrones RPG. They don't want to play in Westeros. Or they don't want to play in Harry Potter because, they're not the boy who lived. Like, that's somebody else, and I want to be the star. Reincarnations allow us to do that. So now you can be King Arthur reincarnated. There's a lot of wonderful stories about King Arthur coming back, and some of them are set in historical eras of the past. One of my favorites is called Arthur, King. Arthur King, and it's King Arthur wakes up during the Battle of Britain, and he becomes a fighter pilot flying a fighter in the defense of England against the Nazis. King Arthur versus Nazis is kind of a no-lose proposition for me. I'm sorry.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it does. And so that's why in my game, part of the explanation for why King Arthur has come back, I'm blaming Nazis. So there's a Templar conspiracy and the Illuminati, and there's all kinds of supernatural elements, and Dracula's in there and all kinds of stuff. But I was never going to make a game that's set in the present and couldn't blame everything on Nazis. Anyway, so it's just modern day games are enormous fun. I have been talking for a long time. I'm worried that we're going to come to the end here. So I feel like before we do, I just have to note, we have a Kickstarter.
Don't worry, we're not running out of time yet unless you're short on time.
Oh, no, but I have a terrible habit of talking too much, and anyone who's been listening can tell because I never shut up.
For an interview like this, it's not a problem.
Okay, good, great, good. But so that's why we set in the present. And I love telling present modern day games because it allows me to critique and talk about and bring in elements of popular culture. For example, it's very tempting when doing a King Arthur story to get into politics. And I don't want to offend anybody, so I'm not going to get into recent events in the American political sphere. But one of the antagonists in the game is a reincarnation of King Lot. Now, most people won't know who King Lot is, but in the Sword in the Stone episode, when Arthur is like 16 years old and pulls the sword out of the stone and he gets made king, England was not unanimously behind this 16-year-old kid who isn't even old enough to grow a beard yet to become king. And his primary rival was this guy named Lot, and he was the king of Orkney and the Isles. He was Scottish. He was a Scottish king. And he was a grizzled commander who had fought his way to his kingship. He'd basically taken his kingdom by force. And Lot is reincarnated in Arthur Lives, and he's a primary antagonist. And he's a general. He's a general in the U.S. Army, retired. Well, he's running for president. And his idea is he wants to steal the Arthur legend. He wants to run for president and take over and keep Arthur from screwing everything up like he did last time. And that plot I refer to as CODIS, King of the United States. And so this is just one example of the way that you can kind of get into current events and play with it in the modern day. You can't run that story in the 6th century. You can run a lot of other stories, but you can't run CODIS in the 6th century. So it's just, there's a lot of fun. There's a lot of options.
As we've mentioned before, there's no shortage of Arthurian legends and Arthurian stories. What is your preferred version?
Oh, that's such a loaded question. It's like asking a father, like, who's your favorite baby,
You can have options. I won't limit you to just one.
Well, the influences on this game are Camelot 3000, Mage, and Greg Stafford's Pendragon. But I also think that we have to give a nod to Boorman's movie Excalibur, which, for all of its flaws, and it is a movie that is, 30 years old, I think now, 40 maybe, I don't know, it's maybe 35, it's in there somewhere. It's got some flaws and it hasn't all held up. But what an influential picture. I mean, for a lot of people growing up who were watching it, free on cable or whatever, that was their version of the King Arthur story for a very long time. Nicole Williamson's Merlin, with that creepy voice that he uses, is still Merlin for so many people. And I have a deep affection for that film, even though it's bad as a hatter,
The main Merlin for me is Sam Neill.
Oh, right, from the it was like a miniseries, wasn't it?
It was titled Merlin.
Yeah, and Sam Neill was great, and I loved that movie. That's a great example of someone taking the Arthurian story and saying, you know what, let's just throw all of this out the window and make it up as we go, And it was super fun, and it had characters like Nimue and Morgana, but then it just invented all kinds of stuff. And you know what? Nobody knew the difference. I mean, to most people, they don't care. I try to embrace that. I really do. A lot of folks are purists, but I'm kind of a pop culture guy. And now, all this being said, I mean, there is no replacement, no substitute for reading Malory himself. Go back and read the actual Arthurian book, Le Morte d'Arthur. There's a couple of different versions of Malory. For a century and a half, the only version that we knew about was Caxton's. Caxton was the publisher, the printer that put out Malory's book. Malory himself was a knight from the War of the Roses era who wrote the entirety of the Arthurian book while in jail. He was imprisoned for horse thievery, and for kind of being a bandit and a brigand. The short version is he was just on the wrong side of the Wars of the Roses. And he was locked up, had a lot of time on his hands, but he was very close to bookstores. And so he would send people down to buy books of Arthurian legend, and then he would translate them and rewrite them out of the French and into English. And that's the version of Arthur that's been the most influential in the world today. Well, then a very funny thing happened, and it's a really great story. Several decades ago, someone found a rogue copy of Malory's book buried in a church up in northern England. And it was given over to a scholar named Vinaver. And Vinaver figured out what he had. And what he had a version of Malory, but not the version Caxton had published. And in many ways, it's an easier read. It's easier to understand, and it makes more sense than the Caxton version. And that's I'm getting very academic here. I'm getting very scholarly. But if you go out looking for a King Arthur legend to read, it's the Norton version of King Arthur, La Morte d'Arthur, and it's the Vinaver translation. Malory wrote basically about a dozen different Arthur stories. And if you think of them as 12 different stories, they make perfect sense. But what some people have tried to do is merge them all together into one great big story. Well, they're contradictory. Characters die early, and they show up later, 100 pages later. And you're like, well, I thought you died, and it's really weird. It's almost like Pulp Fiction does King Arthur.
Kind of like the original Beowulf.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't get me started on Beowulf, because I translated every line of that thing at Madison when I was a grad student. So I love Beowulf.
That's impressive.
Yeah, well, it was an experience, let me tell you. But I still get to teach Beowulf every semester, and I love that poem. But yes, and so much like Beowulf, much like that book, we only have one copy of Beowulf, and it survived a fire. The library in which that book was held, the library caught on fire, and you can open up the pages of Beowulf, and you can see the burn marks on the sides of the paper where the fire almost consumed it. And 5 minutes later, and we would never know Beowulf. That poem would not exist. The last copy of it would have gone up in smoke.
Wow.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. A book on fire. Well, anyway, so my favorite version, I mean, the version that we have to all kind of bow down to is Malory. But in film and in comics, I have to call out Excalibur and Mage and Camelot 3000, which are just totally loopy, but super fun.
Awesome. Well, now seems like a good time to talk about the Kickstarter.
Yeah, and I apologize for bringing it up earlier, but I get carried away, Anyway.
Not a problem.
Yeah, okay, so the Kickstarter. So, Fainting Goat Games, Mike Lafferty is the publisher there, and Mike has been after me for years to redo Arthur Lives and publish it in Fate using Kickstarter. We finally got all of our ducks in a row, and the Kickstarter launches on the 2nd of April, because we're not fools.
Ha.
And so the early goal, the first goal is I think about $6,000, and that will get us to a paperback and PDF edition of Arthur Lives, which is completely written, by the way. That's the beautiful thing about this, is the whole book is already written.
So the fundraiser is for publishing.
Exactly. It's about 250 pages, we think, when the art is done. When all the art comes in, there'll be about 200. So it's a big book. It's about 150,000 words. And backers will all get it. That's the great thing, is that the minute you back the book at the $5 level, we will send you the entire raw text for Arthur Lives, and you can start playing it right away. And so no matter what happens, you get the game. But if we make our goals, we'll get a handsome paperback edition with a ton of art from a lot of industry pros. Michael Kucharski, he's the artist for the Amber Diceless role-playing game, and he drew for Palladium for a long time back. You're not a tabletop gamer, so these names mean nothing to you, but I know. But to longtime gamers, this makes sense. Lords of Gossamer and Shadow, which is the current kind of heir to the Amber Diceless role-playing game. Did you ever read Roger Zelazny's Chronicles of Amber?
I have not.
Oh, well, you have a treat ahead of you, because those are amazing books. But anyway, and Dan Smith, who just drew the crap out of like everything Steve Jackson Games published for about a decade. He was the artist for a lot of Steve Jackson games, including their adaptations of Vampire the Masquerade and their Innomine game.
Ooh, now that is something I'm familiar with.
Oh, you know Innomine?
Vampire the Masquerade.
Oh, Vampire the Masquerade, yeah. Steve Jackson Games did a GURPS conversion of vampire, werewolf, and mage, which I found amazing. This is before the open license era, and nobody did conversions. It was kind of unheard of. And Dan was the artist in all those books, and he has this really bold, exciting black and white style. And when I went looking for an artist to illustrate the bestiary, we've got about 45 fantastic creatures and potential allies and rival incarnations and all kinds of creatures from the fairy veil or demons and angels and all kinds of stuff. And it's the biggest chapter in the book in terms of art. And I went looking for one person to do the entire chapter. I wanted to give it all a unified theme. And I thought, there's no way that I could get Dan Smith. And I wrote to him and he was like, yeah, I'd love to do it. And I was just floored. It was like the clouds parted and a beam of sunlight hit me. And I was like, holy crap, this might actually work. Anyway, so the game is already written and backers will get that text. And then our first basic goal is just kind of that paperback edition. And then all of the art for like the chapter breaks and the bestiary chapter and all that stuff. That's a very early goal. We've got a bunch of other goals set in there. We've got Rob Wieland and Richard Bellingham, who are two very well-known Fate authors who have published for the Fate line before. They're both coming on to write adventures for Arthur Lives, along with Chuck Rice and Walt Robilliard. A couple of other game publishers have also agreed to do it, so we'll do that as an adventure anthology. I've got a couple of adventures as stretch goals too, introductory adventures designed to get all your players together and to get the characters to recognize themselves. One of the plot elements of Arthur is that the player characters do not begin the game knowing that they are reincarnations. The players know, but the characters don't. And that happens during play. They recognize themselves during play when they reenact familiar moments, or when they walk familiar places, or handle familiar objects, or talk to familiar people.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it becomes an adventure that the players help write. So, for example, the classic example of this is get your Arthur player character to pull a weapon out of an immovable object, right? He pulls a crowbar out of a tub of concrete, or pulls a baseball bat out of a dumpster, or whatever, pulls a hockey stick out of a frozen lake. I got to do that one once. And when he does that, he remembers who he is, or in my case, it was she. She remembers that she's Arthur. And there's a lot of gender bending in Arthur Lives, because nothing requires you to come back in the body of your original gender. So once that happens, well, now you also recognize all of the other people around you that don't know who they really are. So you're like, oh, wait a minute. I know I'm Arthur, but Guinevere doesn't know she's Guinevere. So what can I do to help her remember? And that all the GM has to do is kind of sit back and let the players write the adventure for him. It's super fun. So, and then once they've all kind of got themselves recognized and they start to work together, because, getting the player characters together and keeping them together can be really hard in a modern day where characters have no reason to work together. They're not adventurers. They don't meet in a bar like in a classic D&D setup, Well, how do you get these 6 characters from the present day who have no connection to each other to stay together? And the answer is because one of those characters knows that all of the other 5 are Arthurian reincarnations. And so he intentionally reaches out to them and keeps them together until he can get them all to recognize themselves. Well, anyway, once that's done, then they start meeting other people, NPCs, who are reincarnations of the Lady in the Lake or Morgana or Lancelot or whatever, and don't know it. And the players have to figure out, well, let's see, we have to steal this thing from the museum, and we can't do it without thief skills, but the only thief we know is a reincarnation of Nimue, and if we help her find out who she is, it's going to ruin her life. What do we do? Right? So it can get really complicated really fast.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it creates endless stories. And every player character has their modern life with their connections they already have. Maybe they're married, or they have kids, or they got a job to hold down, or what. And Arthur Lives is very much a game of sort of working class heroes. They're not kings and princes anymore. They don't have unlimited wealth. They gotta pay the bills somehow. It's kind of Joss Whedon, Firefly. I want to do the job and get paid, kind of inspired. Or Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Where she's working at the Double Meat Palace.
Or supernatural.
Yeah.
Getting by using credit card fraud.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of these supernatural modern day urban fantasy stories out right now. And I think it's a very fertile ground. And Arthur Lives fits right in with it. In fact, I think we're getting one. I remember reading about a modern day King Arthur television series that I think starts in the fall. So yeah, it's very fertile ground. So and I got off from my topic, but all this is built into the stretch goals. And then one of our final goals is a sort of deluxe hardback edition, which we'll just stuff with lots of extras. So concept art, and we'll put the introductory adventure in there, and I'm going to do liner notes. So when we lay out the book, we're going to leave the sidebars empty. And then if we hit the stretch goal, I'll go in and I will pencil in liner notes, like director's notes, on every single page of the rule book.
Oh, that's cool.
Sort of commenting on like where this idea came from, or how I solved this problem, or why I did this in the way that I did. Because I don't know about you, but I love reading that stuff in role-playing games. When the authors, put in a little author's note or a sidebar kind of talking about how the game works, or, a little behind the curtain.
Insight into the creation of the game.
And I was really inspired by the Dresden Files RPG. Do you know the Dresden Files?
I do. I've read most of the series.
Well, it's adapted for Fate. I don't know if you know this already, but
you mentioned it earlier.
Okay, so Fate is the game system for Dresden Files, and they just came out with a new version of it called Fate Accelerated, which is kind of a simplified, super stripped down version of Fate. Well, anyway, Dresden is another great example of urban fantasy, where even there's a lot of Arthurian myth that shows up in Dresden Files. So he meets the Merlin, and the Excalibur is in Dresden Files in the novels. So the Dresden Files RPG, it's a game book, but it's a game book that's set in the world of Dresden. In other words, Harry Dresden plays D&D, and he knows people that play role-playing games, and so one of his friends in the world of Dresden Files made a role-playing game of the Dresden Files, and that's the book you're holding, right? So in the margins of the book, Harry and what's the name of the skull?
I can't remember.
It's not Yorick, is it?
I don't think so.
Well, anyway,
might be Gary.
Yeah, and all of the other characters in the setting write marginal notes in the margins of the book talking about the game, right? Anyway, it's just wild, and it's super fun to read. So I kind of I was inspired by that when we were doing our hardcover edition.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to hearing about the success of the Kickstarter, learning more, and eventually playing Arthur Lives.
Well, so I just recorded about an hour and a half of live play with my tabletop group just a few days ago on Sunday. And I hope to get it posted soon. So if you don't mind, I'll probably send it to you or send you a link. And
absolutely,
people can hear people playing the conclusion, the last act, basically, of the one of the introductory adventures, which is called Drakes on a Plane.
I get it.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't resist, really. We're all imagining that now. We're imagining Samuel Jackson saying, I'm tired of these bleeping drakes on this bleeping plane, right? Anyway, it's the jumbo jet, passenger jet, is a great way to bring characters together from any background, right? Like you can be in first class, you can be in business, you can be in coach, but you're on the plane.
You could be the pilot.
Yes, absolutely. Good example. Yeah, good. You could be one of the stewardesses. Yeah, absolutely. There's a million things, and there's so many ways things can go wrong. Being on a jet is such a great adventure because you can't get out, right? Like everything is very self-contained. So if you do one session, it's a great kind of enclosed bubble episode, a bottle episode, if you will.
Very, very interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining me and talking mine and the audience's ear off about Arthur Lives, Arthurian legend, role-playing, and creating role-playing games.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm so grateful to be able to be here, and thank you, Ross, for letting me talk up a storm. Thank you.
Oh, it's been a pleasure for me, believe me. So thank you all for listening, watching, and reading. If you enjoyed this interview, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the interview on social media. For more content like and unlike this, visit my website, www.iliveloveplay.com. Live Love Play is produced in association with Busy Little Beaver Productions, blbproductions.com. And until next time, remember to live, to love, and to play every day.